Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. And today I'm really excited. This is Dr. Susan Bernstein from Shift Beyond Strategies, and I'm really excited to talk with you, to share with the audience a conversation about adaptability. That ability for us to pivot, to change, to go in a new direction, to shift, and to shift beyond where we're at now. And if we're going to take our companies and our teams and ourselves as leaders into a future that's always changing, it's just changing at a faster and faster rate, we need to be adaptable. And so I'm having conversations with leaders and really interesting people. And today I'm so excited to bring you Greg Stewart. Greg is the founder and executive director of Ingenuity Design, and that's an agency that's dedicated to elevating and connecting the employee experience. Greg and his team, they breathe strategic life into complex projects and transform them into impactful employee communications and experiences for clients that include Thumbtack, eBay, and TD Bank. And Ingenuity Design partners with internal communications, HR, and employee experience leaders to advise them and create value driven employee experiences across the employee lifecycle to essentially help make companies great places to work. And we all want that. Greg happens to hail from where I live now, San Diego. He's a native of this place and a transplant adaptability to Connecticut. He's an 8-time Ironman triathlon finisher, a husband and a father to 2 teenage girls, and I'm sure that takes a lot of adaptability. Greg, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And don't rub it in anymore about being in San Diego right now.
We're recording this in March, and are you getting snow right now in Connecticut?
No, weather's not too bad, but we still have some pretty brutal mornings that I don't like waking up to now, knowing that it's baseball season. It doesn't feel like baseball season because it's still pretty darn cold.
Well, we always welcome you here in San Diego, and if it helps, we're gonna have a giant storm this weekend. So
Makes me
we're
feel a little bit better that it's
due
sunny
for
here
a
then.
bit of rain. Anyway, I wanted to talk to you about adaptability. And one of the things leading up to this, you and I had a conversation about that and how that plays in organizations, and especially because you work so much with the employee experience and really understanding what's going on for employees. One of the things that we talked about is how company values and behavior allow for flexibility to adapt to big changes. Would you share some of your own experience on that?
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's a broad subject that gets really interesting with big companies. And so we had this really interesting conversation that started with the word change. And when you start thinking about what change means and does that feel positive or negative, and the idea of adaptability and being more like welcoming to receiving that feedback. And so the idea for me, when you think about values and how that can start at the top from how a company really believes in certain values that can support a flexible structure to create the welcoming of change and adaptability, is something that we really see companies working with more frequently and with more success. The idea of having managers that are too rigid or too isolated to feel like they have the ability to shift and manage change or react to things that are happening is something that's, I think, all too common. And you have large companies that often are in a situation that don't allow for that. And so you think about a value, that a company really believes in wholeheartedly, being nimble and being flexible and empathy, these kind of real key values that allow for somebody to understand and react in a more live way to people versus a more rigid structure, which is, deliver, and all of the other ones that are kind of the opposite spectrum that aren't very human driven. And you see a difference of how people react to change and how managers feel like they have the own ability to kind of adjust and take some leadership qualities that they should have to support their team.
That's so interesting. And you're making me think about a conversation I had yesterday with a bunch of senior leaders, in this case in operations. And one of them made a really interesting point that I think plays into what you're saying, Greg, about it used to be in the past that leaders, managers needed to focus on results. Let's get it, let's drive, let's get this endpoint, that new product shipping, that new customer, onboarded. And now what we're realizing is that we need relationships. We need to focus on our relationships with people. And so that brings up the whole thing that you're talking about, like, does a company value empathy? If they don't, it's harder to be nimble, it's harder to be adaptable to change and help somebody with that. And especially if the values that you have are more about results than relationships. I wonder
Yeah,
if you have any thoughts about that.
100% right. There's a key respect that people are people and they want to be treated in the same way. When you become a number and just a doer at work without any kind of human respect, you lose, the opportunity to be appreciated. You lose the opportunity to feel like you're a part of something, and you
Mm,
can't grow. You can't grow in an environment that you're just, a a commodity. And companies are realizing that this is not rocket science. This is not something that we can preach and say we know everything, because companies realize this. And I think it's just a matter of making sure that companies are walking the walk of what the value of connections mean, and the idea of driving those relationships, and what happens when you treat employees as people and you do, kind of command their respect, but also treat them as they should be. And if they're asking for a more flexible environment, are you giving it to them, or is your structure back to what we were just talking about, allowing for that or not? Are you saying that you can't have a flexible structure, so you're treating them not fairly or not what they want? And so the idea of recognizing they're human and they have these needs and they have a way of, still delivering, right? They're still being able to execute on a certain mandate that might be required by the business, but also making sure that they are, driven in a relationship that is, bringing people together and being able to be responsive to what the ask is something we see more and more often.
Greg, I'm super curious related to that. You work with some very big companies. How can big companies avoid becoming bureaucratic and rigid with their people? What have you seen be effective with the leaders that you get to work with in terms of, some companies 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 employees. How can a big company keep itself with that small neighborhoodly feel that can feel more flexible? What have you seen
Yeah, we,
work?
we yeah we see a lot of success with companies that create that have a value structure that can appreciate people. Things that are bringing in like ERGs, employee resource groups, and DEI that's really supported and recognizing how important culture is and diversity is. And those things make it feel like you can connect to people and can help others succeed. You create like-minded environments as well as diverse environments that allow people to thrive in their own workplace. Making sure that leaders are transparent, making sure regardless of hardships or success, that leaders are being really open and giving opportunities to everybody that are equal. The idea of, women's pay being out there and other ways that you can actually treat people completely fair is going to allow people to feel that same opportunity as their neighbor and succeed, feel like they're a part of a team and not isolated as an outsider. And so certainly we work with some really good companies that treat people really fairly and have programs like this that are fully supporting the culture and diversity of people, that people do feel a sense of belonging and really respected at work.
It sounds like you work with a lot of companies whose values you resonate with.
For sure, for sure. And we talk about that from a standpoint of, how different it would be to work with a company that doesn't, see eye to eye with us. And what that means, is that mean it's a teaching moment? Will they be able to respect what we want to
Mm,
bring to the table? From our learnings and experience with lots of companies that we've had the privilege of working with for 16 years now, that's one opportunity. But the other is like how to actually kind of drive and support that when you don't see eye to eye, you're not believing in the same things that they do, and it would be very difficult for us. We've talked about it internally for sure.
Yeah. I want to talk about big change, things like layoffs, reorgs. What's been your experience, Greg, with how leaders can keep their people connected before, during, and after these kinds of changes?
Yeah, this is change. This is change. This is a matter of adapting in a positive way. So the idea of the reaction that happens to people who have to leave and the people who have to stay, right, in these opportunities are tough. They're really tough. And if the things that we've found is, and even through some research that we've done in identifying people who have been through layoffs before,
Mm.
the connection that's needed before, during, and after is super important. Being transparent of what's going to happen when you start using words like waves, like this is wave one of people, you don't feel comfortable when you start hearing things like that. And so how can managers and leaders, deliver a very consistent but transparent message with the why we're doing this, what's needed, what does it mean, how to make sure that people are connected even after. So after the news is delivered, what happens? How are people making sure that they still stay connected to others? And the disruption that happens and the change that occurs is not easy for people to deal with. And so the unnerving sense that people carry with them of, is it me next? Is that guilt, remorse, and all these different things that are very emotionally charged, are unique from a standpoint of how individuals manage them, but as a whole, everybody feels the same thing, right? From a standpoint of the impact that just occurred. So it is something that needs to be dealt with, and we find that the more transparent and the more engagement that you can have from leadership and managers throughout that process is really important.
Greg, you're bringing up a really good point that these kinds of situations, like a layoff or a reorg, have emotional elements to them. We respond emotionally to those, not just logically. If I did
Of
that, I'd
course.
just be plug and play, like, oh, I'm just going to go to the next company, no big deal. But it's not that. It's not as easy as that. How do you bring into the leaders that you're working with in the communications? How do you bring up and deal with the emotional issues that are so prevalent in change?
It's a good question. I don't have a one size fits all answer to that. I do think it has to still ladder back to values and being honest with who you are as a company. The more authentic you can be, is the more employees understand. They're smart people, right? You hire people who are really smart that work for you, and so you can't just give big news and then sugarcoat it and say this is how we're going to be and this is great and this is we're going to stay connected and thank you so much for all that you do, when you haven't said that in the past. And people
Mm,
understand that. People know, people see that as what kind of frosting are they trying to put over this that is trying to like kind of glaze us over. And that is not transparent and that's not authentic to who you are as a company. And so I think the idea of making sure that as emotional as you feel as a company you've been, stay with that. And I think that's something that you can't just be like, change your hat and change the way you speak to somebody when it comes to something that occurs as a kind of big change moments within a company's, um, you know, tenure or current situation.
yeah, I think you're bringing up a really key point here. It's one that, again, if I go back to this executive forum that we had yesterday, one of the leaders made a fabulous point. He said that he learned that in a personal relationship, it brings it very much to his work, and that is the idea that when if you're in a relationship and somebody changes the rules, or the way they do things without telling you, that
Yeah.
violates trust. And so what I think I hear you saying, and tell me if I'm off base here, but is that if a company has not been emotionally forthcoming before they do a layoff or some other change, and all of a sudden we're just going to talk about emotions, it's going to be unsettling for people.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be, I think it's unsettling. And also there's a respect, right? From a trust perspective of like, what are they trying to, not tell me, if they're trying to kind of glaze over this, not be honest, not tell me in an authentic way. So again, I know this is kind of preaching to the choir here. So many people know this is like, you can't just, send out one email. We've seen all of the, LinkedIn articles about kind of the bad CEO letter that goes out. And I think this kind of just pays, we just learned that you just have to stay authentic to who you are. And again, that trusted word, that trusted voice, through a process like that or through a change, and that, is really important for people and companies to stay true to.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely stand with you on that one. And I want to go back to something that you said that's so interesting to me. I remember I was an employee of Intel in the 90s, and we had a period of layoffs, and they would talk about waves. What wave are we in?
Hmm.
Would you share, Greg, why from your vantage point that's so not a good thing to do, and what might a company consider doing instead?
Waves is a sequence of a long process. We understand fiscally that companies have to go through certain phases of a process to, you kind of self-diagnose and analyze like where they're at. So we get numbers. The hard part from an emotional standpoint, if you carry hundreds of people, thousands of people within your company that rely on you to trust them. And a wave doesn't give any trust. A wave makes them feel like it's inevitable. Something else is going to happen. How do you make somebody feel a part of a company? I'm going to work together. I'm going to collaborate. I'm going to feel great about what I'm doing. And yet something on the horizon might change it all. It's going to be pulled from underneath me. And so the idea just I'm trying to think of like a really good analogy that could come together. But I think it's really clear that if you have this forecasting idea of like there's something else that's coming and it could be me, there's nothing that's comfortable about that. And there's nothing that's going to drive me to work harder and be a part of something, because now all of a sudden there's a possible end, and this discomfort that you're giving to people doesn't make them feel any more valued or appreciated to be together. So you kind of start that idea of like, I have one foot out the door, like what's going to happen. And so you're trying to, as a manager, trying to build a team, and half your team has one foot out the door because they're uncertain of what's going to happen next.
Mhm.
And you see what can happen really easily from a standpoint of disengagement, and the opposite of what we see as the value of connections and how important that is, and what the success can be when people
Mhm.
feel connected and emotionally responsible for their own work and part of a team. And now you're saying you're not going to be, or there's a chance you might not be, and the opposite effect happens, which is just really hurtful for the company in the long run.
I mean, you're bringing up how important it is to help everyone feel valued and appreciated no matter what. And I'm also realizing, my own experience of that word wave. I'm just seeing it now that it didn't feel like a wave. It probably actually felt like a tsunami. There's a
Yeah,
tsunami that's coming. Like my life is going to get tumbled up. It's not just a wave I'm going to surf. That's how it feels as an employee. So to think, in that way, like, I
yeah.
don't I want to go out in that surf. Thank you very much. Is
Yeah,
there
right. And it goes back to like the word change and adaptability, right? There's a way that you can interpret change as it's coming at me, and adaptability of like, I'm going to ride it. Like, right, there's a kind of a same thing of the interpretation or the subjective nature of what a wave could be. And so the idea of making sure like how it's presented or how it might occur is also something like, is this a tsunami coming at me? Or is this something that we're going to all get boards and ride together? Is a really
Bingo.
interesting way of putting it together to, to the
Bingo.
audience
So
as
it
well.
sounds sounds to me like when you're doing these communications, you're working with leaders to help them say, "Hey, let's all get some boards together. Let's, we're gonna ride."
It can happen. Yep. Yep. It's managed. And again, that kind of goes back to making sure that it's authentic to who they are, but it's the right way of thinking about it from a standpoint of if bad news has to come and there's a change management that has to occur, how can you express that in a way that you can still make people feel a part of it with an outcome that has positive results?
Yeah. So I really appreciate you bringing up the whole idea of trust, and that, even if we're going to teach everybody to ride, we're going to get them all surfboards. Sorry, I can't help it. I'm a San Diegan.
Yeah.
Even if I'm a lousy, lousy surfer, you don't want to watch me surf. It's pretty bad. Um, but I definitely watch my friends who surf, and it's a talent to learn to balance, right? To learn to ride that wave. If we could all go do that together, metaphorically, of course, um, then that feeling of we're riding together, we're gonna laugh, and then we're gonna spill out. Sometimes we're just gonna spill out, but we're there for
Yep.
each other, we're gonna watch for each other. That sounds like a feeling of camaraderie in this, and it sounds like you've been through a few of these processes where you've helped companies to shift it from "this is coming at me" to "we are in this together."
Yeah, and it's the same thing from a company merging or splitting, right? How do you share that news and what is it like, and how do you create a communication strategy that managers understand and then can spread in a really consistent way? How are they delivering that to their team and supporting them, and what does that mean? And so the idea of, hey, there's this balance or uncertainty, but we're all coming about it the same way. We're not going to hear it from the media or hear it from somebody else or get lost within it because somebody told me one way, and then it's a telephone, can of, whatever the can of phone tag that you're like trying to
Yes.
understand and interpret from one person to the next of this is what I think's happening and that's what she said and whatever. And so the idea of making sure that like our managers making sure that they're getting the message. Is there a toolkit? Is there any kind of message that they can then share with their team or presentation that they can share with their team and say, this is what's happening, this is what's going to go on, this is what you're going to see, here's the calendar, here's a schedule, here's what you can expect. And as clear as you can be, is it going to make sure that that wave is all going in the same direction? People are understanding and kind of being able to have a little bit more empathy for the company or for each other, and support, one another in an environment like that.
And those are the kinds of communication tools that you and your team at Ingenuity design help leaders to think through and then create for them to use.
Yeah. Yep. Sure do. Yep. Lots of
Super,
things
super
like that.
important.
Yeah.
Super, super important, because we are all dealing with the velocity of change isn't just slowing down. Change has always been a constant, right? The
Inevitable.
change, that's inevitable.
Yeah.
But it's the speed and the intensity. Gartner has a recent report that in 2016, the average employee at an enterprise size corporation was dealing with two major changes a year. So a new
Wow.
system, a reorg. How many in 2022? You want to take a guess?
Oh, I'm
How
sure
many?
it's doubled from 16 to
It's
22.
gone. Yeah, so it's gone from 2 to 10.
Wow.
10, right?
Yeah.
So how do we help people to be super adaptable and make sure that they have what they need, give them the equivalent of, all right, let's get our surfboards out. Let's take surf lessons. Let's make sure how are we enabling people? And what I've seen, and I'm curious if this is your experience too, is that it's not so much the structural things that people need. They don't, it's not, yes, they need tools, but what they really need is that feeling of connection, that feeling of I'm valued. And that comes through conversations in real time together,
Yeah.
and not from a system or AI or, it just seems to me, and wonder if you feel this, that we need more our humanity more than ever.
For sure. especially again in hybrid environments, remote environments. How are you connecting to people? How are you having real conversations? How do you make people feel part of something that is deeper than a um, a service or a deliverable or other things like that? And how do you get to really know them and appreciate them is super important. We try to help and train managers on the importance of team meetings and one-on-one meetings and what that means and the value that that can bring to somebody, and also the retention that it creates too. The idea of like you're going to keep people longer the more they feel valued and a part of something. The idea of, you know, that the stat from Gartner about 2 to 10, that's so much change in a especially like in a manager's environment where they're so busy. Now you're asking them for all these things, like how many things can they adapt to? Is just again one of those other struggles that we see so often of busy managers. You're asking me to do so much. You want me to have a team meeting, you want me to have one-on-ones, and now you're asking me to, you know, do something else and learn this new program or whatever that is. It's a lot. So that's an interesting stat to lay over, you know, on top of everything we've just talked about too.
It's a hugely important. I mean, that stat when I saw it was, made me gasp. Seriously,
Sure.
like I
Yeah.
work with change all the time, but that number was like, oh, okay, this puts this in context. It's not
Yeah.
doubled. It's quintuple. It's 5 times, whatever. Yeah, it's five
Yeah.
times a 5x impact. So how can we be thoughtful with people and say we've layered on so many different things? Part of that is about how do we prioritize what's most important? How can we look at how likely is this change going to create fatigue, exhaustion, all those things, and
Yep.
really get smart about what do we really pursue in terms of change to keep our organization viable and keep it sustainable, and making sure we're taking care of personal sustainability with each human we work with.
Yep. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great summary.
So I'm just so thankful for our conversation. You've created some really interesting perspectives, and I really admire the work that you do in Ingenuity Partners. Sorry, in Ingenuity Design. I think of you as a group of partners because it's because of your partner that I know you.
Thank you. Thanks for
But
having me. This is great. And again, I think that we see so much similarities between the change that you see and how you're coaching that, and what we see from a standpoint of, you know, of the amount of, again, the people that we talk to from an HR perspective and internal comms and all these other, you know, audiences that we're on the phone with every day, you know, are really similar. So it was a great conversation to have with you. Thank you so
yeah.
much.
Thank you so much. Anyway, to everybody, if there's some things that you've learned here, please share them in the comments. And also, Greg, how can people find you?
Ingenuitydesign.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. But yeah, you're welcome to visit, chat, and connect with us. But happy to have further conversations or be advisors to anybody who has questions on the subjects.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. And I'm sure that this will create all kinds of great ripple effects out there in the world.
Thanks, Susan. Appreciate it.